All right, good evening, First Baptist Church. It's good to see y'all here this evening. What a crowd. All right, if y'all would stand, we're going to start off with some worship. We're going to worship our Heavenly Father with singing, so sing it out. How y'all doing? You sure looking good. Thanks, honey. Life is easy when you're up on the mountain and you've got peace of mind like you've never known. But things change when you're down in the valley. Don't lose faith, for you're never alone. For the God on the mountain is still God in the valley. When things go wrong, He'll make them right. And the God of the good times is still God in the bad times. The God of the day is still God in the night. You talk of faith when you're up on the mountain, but talk comes so easy when life's at its best. Now it's down in the valley of trials and temptations. That's where your faith is really put to the test. For the God on the mountain is still God in the valley. When things go wrong, He'll make them right. And the God of the good times is still God in the bad times. The God of the day is still God in the night. The God of the day is still God in the night. She's back. Well, I did see one little study, Chris, just so I can give you another tip. It said that older women with a little excess weight live longer than men that point that out to them. Just so you know. Just so you know. Okay. On a hill far away stood an old rugged cross, the emblem of suffering and shame. And I love that old cross where the dearest and best for a world of lost sinners was slain. So I'll cherish the old rugged cross till my trophies at last I lay down.
Amen. You may be seated. Thank you, ladies. Good to see everybody tonight. I'm glad that you're here. Open your Bibles this evening to Numbers chapter 20. We're going to look at 20 and 21. If you were here with us last week, we looked at 16 and 17, and you may be asking what happened to chapter 18 and 19. Well, I just confused myself. Chapter 18 and 19, we are skipping, not because we don't want to go over it. If you go back to chapter 18 and 19, those two chapters are dedicated to the responsibilities of the priest and the high priest, and we have covered that in detail in the past, and so I decided not to cover that again in the present. So that brings us to Numbers chapter 20 and 21, and we'll look at chapter 20 and the beginning of chapter 21 tonight. We'll save the rest of chapter 21 for next week. Now let me tell you, last week, if you were with us, nearly 15,000 people were killed because of their sin. God judged them, and they died. Some of them died horrible. All of them died horrible deaths. Tonight, I think only 2 people die. But don't fret. Next week, thousands more are going to die, and so you'll just come back next week and see that. So even though there just a couple of people died tonight, they are very significant people, and it tells us that we are advancing in our story on the Israelites as they are making their way to the promised land. Numbers chapter 20, beginning in verse 1. In the first month, the whole Israelite community arrived at the desert of Zin, and they stayed at Kadesh. There Miriam died and was buried. Well, that is significant. Who is Miriam? Yeah, the sister of Moses. And so before this is all over with, Miriam is going to die, Aaron is going to die, and Moses is going to die. Now, we're not going to look at his death tonight, but the first one to pass away is Miriam. The death of Miriam must have affected Moses and Aaron deeply. It was Miriam to whom the Lord used to save Moses' life when he was a baby, if you remember that. And she even arranged for her own mother to raise Moses and to be paid for it. That's Exodus chapter 2, if you remember that. She had led the praises of the women at the Red Sea. If you remember when they crossed on dry ground, as soon as they got across, she led the women in singing praises to God, and had endured the wilderness trials with her brothers. The only blemish on her record is her criticism of Moses in Numbers chapter 12, and we looked at that some weeks ago when Moses had married a Cushite woman, and she didn't like that, but really it had nothing to do with the woman herself. It had to do with her and her brother's jealousy of Moses. Verse 2, now there was no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. They quarreled with Moses and said, if only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Why did you bring the Lord's community into this desert, that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs, grapevines or pomegranates, and there's no water to drink. Now, this is an interesting complaint. Much of it mirrors the complaints that they given before. But I always like the Israelites because whenever they're complaining, they add a little something to the complaint to make it even better. And so basically their complaint is what? Same old, but what do they want? Oh, they want water, certainly. Now, how many of them have died in the last 40 years from no water? 0. There's a 0 fatality count for lack of water. They've done pretty well, and yet they're complaining. And so what I like about it, and I probably shouldn't, but it says in verse 3, they quarreled with Moses and said, and here's their complaint, if only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Instead of regretting that they were delivered out of bondage, and they'll get to that in just a minute, here they are regretting what? Yeah, God judged the wicked, remember, in the wilderness and killed them on the spot. And now they're complaining because they didn't get killed on the spot along with the other wicked Israelites. I find that remarkable. I don't think there's any pleasing them. And so if only we had died with our brothers. And then they asked the usual question, why did you bring the Lord's community, that's them, by the way, the Lord's community, I'm surprised they bring God into this at all, into this desert that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible place? Now, to be fair, where are they? It tells us in verse 1, they're in the desert of Zin. Don't know if you've ever seen a picture of the desert of Zin. It's still there. It looks like Mars. It is a barren place. Was then, is now. And so I get why they're a little discouraged. There's nothing there. The only reason they're there, though, is because of their sin, not because of God's plan. God planned for them to be eating those giant grapes and enjoying the beautiful land that He had for them, but they didn't get to go there because of their sin. It's the same old problem. At this point, it's a conditioned reflex. Whenever the Israelites faced a difficulty, they complained about it to Moses and Aaron and wept because they hadn't stayed in Egypt. Difficulties either bring out the best in people or the worst. They either mature us or make us more childish. Israel's words and attitudes revealed clearly that their hearts were still in Egypt. Interesting. All right, verse 6. Moses and Aaron went from the assembly to the entrance to the tent of meeting and fell face down, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. The Lord said to Moses, take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. You will bring water out of the rock for the community so they and their livestock can drink. So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he commanded him. So everybody's complaining, we want water. And I started to mention this a while ago. There's what they added to their menu of complaint. They said, this terrible place, it has no grain or figs, grapevines, or pomegranates. So that's what they're missing. They're thinking about those pomegranates. And again, I know I told you before, we used to, for many seasons, watch Survivor every year. I call it Spoiled Americans in the Real World. And so they put these Americans out on an island to live like half the world has to live all the time. That is, they have to fend for themselves. And as always it happens, inevitably in every season, all of these spoiled Americans are sitting around in a circle, rubbing their tummies, and they start talking about all that they're missing back home, all of those delicious foods. Now, nothing on the list of the Americans is like the list of the Israelites, but they're lamenting it nonetheless. Usually there's talk of steak and chicken fried something and French fries and burgers and delicious, rich American food. But the Israelites don't know anything about Tex-Mex, bless their hearts. And so their complaint is, their longing is for grain and figs, grapevines, that means grapes, and frankly, wine, and pomegranates. Now, I've never eaten a lot of pomegranates. I don't have a craving for that, but they did. And so they said that. And then they put on the very end, and there's no water to drink. The thing about water, the one thing that they really needed to stay alive, made it at the end of the complaint. And so verse 6, Moses and Aaron went from the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell face down. Now look at the last part of this. And the glory of the Lord appeared to them. Now this is actually a little different than what has happened before. I'll get to that in just a minute. It was the people who should have been on their faces, confessing their sins and seeking God's forgiveness. But once again, Moses and Aaron fell before God and sought his wisdom and his help. Spiritual leaders pay a price as they seek to serve God's people, but the people usually don't appreciate it. The same people repeat the same sins and refuse to trust God and to obey Him. The rod that Moses had was the same staff that was used to do wonders in Egypt, especially to part the Red Sea. The Hebrew word for rock means a high cliff, a place for a fortress, and not just simply a boulder, which is interesting. So God says, I tell you what, I want you to do what? And this is unusual. You take the staff. Let me reread it again. Verse 7, the Lord said to Moses, take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. So here's what God says to Moses, and it's an unusual way to do it. God's in charge. He can do it any way he wants. He says, I want you to take the staff. You don't do anything with the staff. You don't twirl it around. You certainly wouldn't strike anything with it. Just hold the staff, and I want you to speak to the rock. Now that's a tough thing because Moses and Aaron are going to be mad at this point because of all these whiny people. Now here's what makes this different. What has happened in the past is God comes down in the cloud, the glory of God comes down, and God takes care of matters. He kills them in mass often, and that's what has happened in the past. And so Moses and Aaron go in to complain to God, and God is supposed to say, I'm going to come down and I'll take care of them once and for all. And Moses gets to be the good cop because God's the bad cop here. And Moses says, as he usually does, oh, don't kill them all, then that'll make you look bad. Let's spare them. And God spares them. That's not what God does here. God never says he's going to kill any of them. In fact, what does God do? Give them the water. That's what God decides to do. I tell you what, Moses, you go out to the rock, just speak to it. Water will come out. It's all good. That's not what Moses wanted, though. He wants to see lightning, apparently, and I don't blame him. Verse 10, he and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, listen, you rebels. Must we bring you water out of this rock? Who's bringing the water? God. Well, that's not what Moses says. Must we bring you water? Apparently, Moses thinks it's Moses and God. That's the team effort there. Must we bring you water out of this rock? Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. Provoked in his spirit, instead of speaking to the rock, Moses struck it twice. He also spoke angrily to the people, calling them rebels, and he gave them the impression that he and Aaron had supplied the water along with God. It was a sad demonstration of hostility by the meekest man on earth, showing that we can fail in our strengths as well as our weaknesses. If our righteousness leads us to disobey God, then our righteousness really isn't righteousness. It's something else. So that led me to the question as I read this, how do we fall into that sin? Can you give me any examples where we as God's people in the middle of our righteousness and anger leads us to sin? I know I don't often ask questions, but we think we know better. And what happens when we think we know better? Yeah, we do what what Moses and Aaron did. We take matters into our own hands. But what do we do? Do you know, Christians, even if you don't want to confess, let's talk about the people in front of you. Well, yeah, the hypothetical people. Well, or beside you, in the case of Roxanne and Wendy, who are both pointing their finger at the other right now. What do we do when we feel that we are righteous that causes us to sin? All right, judge other people? I would say, and we don't use this term because it's a strong term, we hate other people. I see a lot of that going on. If we don't like what other people's doing, our knee-jerk response, our old nature, is simply to hate them, especially when we sense that they already hate us too. Now, I'm not saying that we should agree with people, but you understand how quickly our righteousness can lead us to sin, and myself included, in the midst of our righteousness. Some of the most hateful people I've ever known were super righteous Christians. And so be careful about that. If you're watching online, that's one of our challenges. Moses was a very righteous man, but his righteousness, and he was right to be angry, but his righteousness did not give him a justification or an excuse to disobey God. And that was his excuse. Because God told him to do something that was different than what he thought God would do or thought God should do. If it were up to Moses, he would have had God do something else. And I think that Moses was mad at the people, but he may have been mad at God for not doing what he thought God should do, and so he struck that rock. Interestingly, he struck it twice. I don't know that it would have mattered had he struck it once or 3 times. I would have struck it 20 or 30. Because I'm really righteous and angry. I can understand, and you can understand Moses, and we can be sympathetic with his anger, but we have to be very careful that in our righteous anger, that we don't let it to be an excuse to disobey God. And there are a lot of bad paths we can take in the middle of our righteousness. Moses was human, just as we are, and no doubt weary as he drew near to the end of the wilderness march, during which he'd seen nothing but unbelief and heard nothing but complaining. Psalms chapter 106, verse 32 states that it was the people who provoked Moses to anger, and that isn't hard to believe. Perhaps he was emotionally drained because of the death of his sister, because she had just died. She had always been with him, even since he was born, and he just lost her. Whatever it was, when the people complained, it set him off. And again, this is unusual for Moses, but still it was no excuse for him to disobey God. No matter what the mitigating causes we might produce, the fact remains that we must obey God. All right. Now, I read this in this commentary. This is the Bible Exposition Commentary. If I can find my place again. The remarkable thing, this commentary says this, the remarkable thing is that God gave the water, even though Moses' attitude and actions were all wrong. Did you notice that? He struck the rock. And logically, you would think we would read in the verse, Moses struck the rock twice and got nothing. God went ahead and gave the water, even though Moses disobeyed, but it cost him dearly. And they didn't deserve the water, certainly. Verse 12. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community in the land I give them. Well, he says that to Moses and Aaron. And I've got to think, I'm reading between the lines here, that Aaron is standing there saying, hey, I didn't strike anything. Why am I not going to get to go into the Holy Land? Well, he was just as mad as Moses, and I'm tempted to think that because now Miriam's gone, it's Moses and Aaron, that there was a brief committee meeting after God appeared to them in the tent and said, go speak to the rock, that on their way to tell the people or whatever, that there was words exchanged between them, and the heart of Aaron was no different than the heart of Moses. Look in verse 13. These were the waters of Meribah, where the Israelites quarreled with the Lord and where he showed himself holy among them. The people were helped, but Moses was disciplined in a most painful way. He would not be permitted to enter the Holy Land or the Promised Land. He had glorified himself instead of glorifying God, or maybe we can say that he drew attention to himself rather than attention to God. The first time God provided water for Israel, by the way, Moses called the place Massah and Meribah, which means testing and quarreling. On this second occasion, Moses called the place Meribah, which means quarreling. But it was he who had been tested, and he failed the test. All right, look with me in verse 14. Moses sent messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom, saying, "This is what your brother Israel says. You know about all the hardships that have come upon us. Our forefathers went down into Egypt, and we lived there many years. The Egyptians mistreated us and our fathers, but when we cried out to the Lord, he heard our cry and sent an angel and brought us out of Egypt. Now we are here at Kadesh, a town on the edge of your territory. Please let us pass through your country. We will not go through any field or vineyard or drink water from any well. We will travel along the king's highway and not turn to the right or to the left until we have passed through your territory." Let me stop right there and say, this is a reasonable request, and they're making the request to what nation? To the Edomites. Now, the Edomites were the descendants of Edom. Who was Edom? Edom means red, the red one. And that is Esau. That is the brother of Jacob. And so Jacob's family, his nation, the Israelites, are coming up and they need to go through their territory. So you have the Israelites and the Edomites, both of whom came from Isaac. They were brothers. And so these are kinsmen to them. This is all one big family who, by the way, have never gotten along. I think it's a reasonable thing for Moses to say. And so he writes this beautiful letter and he says to the Edomites, he refers to them as us and our fathers. He's talking to them like family. And he says, hey, we're home. We're back. We're just passing through. And I tell you what, if you'll let us go through your territory, we don't want any quarrels. We're not going to drink your wells dry. We're not going to eat your fruit. We're just going to come straight through on the main road. We're going to take I-20 straight through. Is that okay? Well, the Edomites don't take that well. Can't tell you why. But, verse 18, but Edom answered, "You may not pass through here. If you try, we will march out and attack you with the sword." Well, that's not very welcoming. Maybe you have relatives that don't get along with you very well. Verse 19, the Israelites replied, "We will go along the main road, and if we or our livestock drink from any of your water, we will pay for it. We only want to pass through on foot, nothing else." Again, verse 20, they answered, "You may not pass through." Then Edom came out against them with a large and powerful army. Since Edom refused to let them go through their territory, Israel turned away from them. So Israel was marching north to the plains of Moab, where Moses would prepare the new generation to enter the land. It's finally time. They need to do this one thing. The easiest route was to go through Edom on the king's highway, the main route at that time, and the Edomites were descendants of Esau, and so it just made sense. But knowing the history of conflict between Esau and Jacob, Moses used very sound diplomatic tactics as he requested permission to pass through, but it didn't work. Look at verse 22. The whole Israelite community set out from Kadesh and came to Mount Hor. At Mount Hor, near the border of Edom, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, Aaron will be gathered to his people. He will not enter the land I give to the Israelites, because both of you rebelled against my command at the waters of Meribah. Get Aaron and his son Eleazar to take them up on Mount Hor. Remove Aaron's garments and put them on his son Eleazar, for Aaron will be gathered to his people. He will die there. Now, I'll stop there just for a moment. What did they do to the Edomites? Nothing. What did God do to the Edomites? Nothing here. Now, God's going to judge them, but that's in the future. Right now, nothing happens at all. And it seems odd, because that is not what happens to everybody else they encounter in the promised land. Everybody else they encounter gets wiped out, but not the Edomites, not yet. And so they go ahead and go a different route, and they come to Mount Hor, and God says to them, says to Moses, I want you and Aaron to go up on the mountain, and Aaron will be gathered to his people. What does that mean? Yeah, it's time for Aaron to die. Well, I'm not much of a mountain climber, but I would think this is not going to be the funnest climb for Aaron, because he knows when he gets up there, it's his last trip. In fact, God has him take off his priestly, because he's the high priest, his ephod and his priestly robes, and put it on his son Eleazar. And so he says, go up there and do that, and you'll be gathered. Verse 27, Moses did as the Lord commanded. They went up Mount Hor in the sight of the whole community. Moses removed Aaron's garments and put them on his son Eleazar, and Aaron died there on top of the mountain. Then Moses and Eleazar came down from the mountain, and when the whole community learned that Aaron had died, the entire house of Israel mourned for him for 30 days. Both Moses and Aaron had rebelled against God when Moses struck the rock, so neither of them would enter the promised land on the first day of the 5th month of that 14th year. Moses, Aaron, and Eleazar went somewhere on Mount Hor because it was now time for Aaron to die. Moses would say goodbye to a beloved brother, and Eleazar to a revered father. Aaron was 123 years old. Well, at 123, I'll be ready to go. 123, wow. However, Aaron's death did not interrupt the ministry of the priesthood, for Eleazar took his place. As John Wesley used to say, God buries his workmen, but his work goes on. In fulfillment of the law, Moses took the holy garments from his brother and put them on Eleazar. He probably anointed him as well for the new office. And when Moses and Eleazar returned to the camp without Aaron, and the people saw Eleazar dressed in the robes of the high priest, they knew that Aaron's life had ended. They mourned for Aaron for 30 days, which takes us now into the 6th month. Eleazar was the third son of Aaron. The first two, if you remember, Nadab and Abihu, what happened to them? Yeah, they did. They were slain by the Lord for defiling the tabernacle with false fire. Before becoming high priest, he was the chief leader of the Levites, Aaron was, for caring for the tabernacle. He would assist, is this? Yeah, this is, yeah. He was the chief leader of the Levites for caring for the tabernacle. He would assist Moses in taking the census of the new generation, as well as in commissioning Joshua to succeed Moses. When Israel had conquered the land, Eleazar helped Joshua assign each tribe its inheritance. So Eleazar is actually going to play a major role. Moses has experienced 2 family funerals now back to back, 2 confrontations with critics in the camp, and a personal failure at Kadesh. Yet he packs up his rod and he goes right back to work. All right, any comments about Numbers chapter 20? All right, we're just going to look at the very first part of chapter 21, and then we'll look at our prayer list for the week. Look with me in chapter 21. When the Canaanite king of Arad who lived in the Negev, heard that Israel was coming along the road of Antharium. He attacked the Israelites and captured some of them. Let me stop right there just a second. That seems like an odd thing to say, is it not? I always remember their entrance into the Holy Land with the great victory that God gave them at where? Remember, they went around and round Jericho. That great miracle that happened where they didn't have to lift their sword or do anything, but actually before they even got there, this terrible thing happens. They're doing what they're supposed to do, but this king attacked the Israelites and captured some of them. Verse 2, then Israel made this vow to the Lord. If you will deliver these people into our hands, we will totally destroy their cities. The Lord listened to Israel's plea and gave the Canaanites over to them. They completely destroyed them and their towns, so the place was named Hormah. Now you see the difference is the response of the Israelites. This is really a big turning point for them. They come to this realization, hey, we need some help here. We need God's help, or we're not going to make it very far, because immediately some of them got captured. So they go to God. They didn't complain to God. How could you allow this to happen? We're better off dead in the desert. We should never have left Egypt. They don't say any of that here. What do they say? We need your help. In fact, they offer God a deal. They say, God, if you will give us victory, we will wipe them out. Everything will be dedicated to God, basically, is what they're saying. And so they make this appeal to God, plea to God, and God hears their cry. The news of Israel's march from Egypt to Kadesh had gone before them, and the rulers of the city-states in and around Canaan weren't going to, the rulers weren't going to go give in to these intruders without a fight. Apparently, Israel wasn't prepared for this first attack, because some of their people were taken prisoners, but the leaders immediately turned to God for his help. They vowed to utterly destroy the Canaanites and their cities if God would give them victory. To utterly destroy, and that's the words used here, meant to devote something completely to the Lord. We see that in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy. Wiping out the people and their cities and giving all the spoils to God. This is what Israel would do at Jericho, by the way. And because Achan took what belonged to God, he was slain. We're going to see that in Joshua chapter 7 in the months to come. The Canaanite culture was unspeakably wicked, especially their religious practices, and God wanted these nations removed from the earth. There might be people that would say, how could God allow this? How could God allow them to wipe out everybody, men, women, and children? You have to understand, first of all, that there's not a single person ever created that is not created by the hand of God. God made you. He made me. And he has the right to do with us anything he chooses. God alone has that right to take life, and he chooses to do this here. The second thing you need to understand, that God is transcendent. He sees not only what is behind us, but what is ahead of us. God knew every generation, every future generation for those wicked people. He knew what those wicked people were going to do when they grew up, and what their children and grandchildren were going to do when they grew up. He had already seen their future wickedness, and he had had enough of them already and decided to wipe them out. Again, he had the right to do that. So God gave Israel victory over the enemy, and the people, and this is a shock, the people kept their promise. They destroyed Arad and the other cities connected with it. I say it's a shock. They didn't usually do what he told them to do, but here they did. And they gave a new name to the area, Hormah, which means destruction. This conflict was quite a contrast to the defeat Israel experienced 38 years before, when they tried to engage the enemy without the blessing of God. Big difference in outcome. When Joshua assigned the tribes their inheritance in Canaan, he gave this area to Judah and to Simeon, those two tribes. All right, now I'm going to look at verse 4 and 5 real quick, and then we're going to start there next week. I want to give you a free preview This is one of the greatest stories in all the Bible, by the way. So you want to be sure to be here next week. Verse 4. They traveled from Mount Hor along the route to the Red Sea to go around Edom. But the people grew impatient on the way. They spoke against God and against Moses and said, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the desert?" Wow, they never said that before. "There is no bread, there is no water, and we detest this miserable food." There's no bread, there's no water. Now, you and I know what happens if you go very long without water in the desert. You die. But none of them have died, so they're not really that thirsty at this point. There's no bread, there's no water, and we detest this miserable food. They don't like the food that they do have. I worked on a dig and lived in Israel for 3 months in 1987. And after 3 months of falafels and shawarma, I felt the same way. They didn't like the food. And so they complained. All right. Now, I'm not going to tell you everything that happened, but there is this movie that I have not seen called Snakes on a Plane. It has Samuel L. Jackson in it. I didn't see it. I couldn't get past the title. That's the title of the movie, Snakes on a Plane. Well, this is Snakes on the Plane. It's what's coming up. Snakes everywhere. We'll see that next week. All right. That concludes our Bible study for the week. If you'll take your prayer sheet, and we'll pray over our members and the folks that are on our prayer sheet.